Hello, everyone, and welcome to Women in U.S. History. What we're looking at today is just the introduction, so this isn't going to be too long of a discussion, and I don't have any PowerPoint for this. Normally, I'll have images or a short video that we're going to watch with the lecture. This is normally just kind of the introduction I give on the first day of kind of why we study women in U.S. history and the major kind of themes that are going to play throughout the semester. So keep that in mind as we kind of break down the points, that these are things that they come up in every single topic and every single thing that we talk about. What we're going to look at today are going to show up over and over again. So they're important themes to kind of hold on to and remember. And look at how they evolve and adapt over time, and also where they stay the same, because there is this kind of maddening continuity of issues that just keep reappearing, even as some things change. The kind of core issues keep kind of being brought up over and over again, and which you could argue still to this day are items that are still discussed in many ways. We haven't really moved past these issues and these kind of three main areas that have really come to be key components of women's roles in the United States. So before we get into those three kind of main points, I did want to look just at kind of the where women have been in history of the study of history and how it's been seen in the past. If you look at 20 plus years ago, the study of women in history was relatively small, and there's still remnants of that today. You definitely can take a regular United States history course and learn very little about women's roles within that process. So it certainly hasn't been eradicated. It is more prevalent than it has been. As within the last 10 years, there's definitely been a significant uptick in that. However, with how women have been defined in history, in the study of history, are usually in kind of three ways. Everything's kind of in threes. That was not intentional, by the way. So one is big names. The idea of that if you were studying in a traditional United States history class or any other history class, you could apply this often with the study of world history or Western civilizations, is that women are often excluded there as well. But where they do pop up, and where they have popped up in the past, is with the really big names. So a good one outside of the United States would be Cleopatra, right? She is a kind of a massive name that was such a huge historical figure that you can't really completely sideline her. In United States history, you see that with usually Abigail Adams, which was John Adams' wife, and some of the roles that she played there. Harriet Tubman with the Underground Railroad, and then Elizabeth Cady Stanton is often mentioned within the abolition movement, women's rights, that type of thing, and so on. So you have these periods in history where you have a certain woman that played such a big role that it can't be ignored. But then what you have happen is that the history of women within whatever history you're studying gets regulated just to these few select figures, and not expanded upon in any kind of larger way. This then goes with big events. And these usually go hand in hand, right? Because we're talking about that they were such big historical figures. Well, they're usually the big names come because they participated in such massive events. And so, whether that's Cleopatra, who was the last queen of Egypt, or whether that was Harriet Tubman, which was within the movement of the Underground Railroad and the Civil War and Reconstruction, although that's often talked about a whole lot less than her role within the Civil War and that period. so that you have, again, regulated to these specific events rather than looking at the overarching components of that. And then lastly, they often are shown as supporters or helpers. And most of the time to men, right, in that way. So that you might talk about, Abigail Adams is a good example of this one. Abigail Adams, and we will look at her. She's an important figure, and I don't want it to be remiss that these big events are important too, because they are such formative cases and people. You have to talk about them, but we're going to look beyond just big names and big events. But Abigail Adams is often, almost always, tied to her husband, John Adams, in part because he played a really important role in the formation of the United States as well. And so in order to talk about what she did, you want to look at how that was connected to him, specifically with some of the primary source documents. We're going to be looking at a letter between her husband and her. And it shows a really good connection to how even before the Revolutionary War was really fully in motion, you had women who were pushing for women's rights and the right to vote. Abigail Adams was one of those, and she wrote her husband, and it's often titled "Remember the Ladies," because that is a quote in her letter that she says, when you are writing these new laws and constitution, I ask that you remember the ladies, and it goes on from there. And so she gets termed. She did more than that, and like I said, we're going to look at the larger role that women played in the Revolutionary War. But you often get where then it's this case of she gets tied to John Adams, and so you talk about John Adams, and then you mention his wife in this brief way, and then it goes back to John Adams and the other founding fathers. And largely excludes women's roles throughout that entire process. So the history, women in history, in the past and still to this day sometimes, is often defined in these ways. So what we're going to do is that we're going to expand upon that. And we're going to expand by not only looking at those things, but more importantly, how society and culture was shaped by women. Women played a massive role in defining, shaping, creating the United States. And they were involved in every major thing that you would talk about in a normal United States history course. They were there, and not just as helpers, not just as wives, but actively participating. And that's the other part of that. Women as active participants. Okay, so we want to take a look at how they were involved in that. And then, of course, from a women's point of view. And looking at not just from the male point of view, but how did women see these events? How did women approach them? Why did they? And so kind of looking at this, and this is important, I think, in U.S. history and any history. We're doing a narrow definition here, right? Because the class is women in U.S. history. And so we're getting to then have a specific emphasis and focus on women within the United States. And of course, there's so many different perspectives and peoples that were involved in the creation of the United States and participated in life in the United States, that it's impossible to look at every single perspective in detail. You have to pick what you want to emphasize. What I think is important and is often not done in regular history, any history, is making sure to look at history as it unfolds from multiple perspectives. So that's not just women, but in the case like with U.S. history, within not only the terms of like the early colonial period and slavery early on there as Africans were brought over. So African women's perspectives from that very beginning of slavery and how they experienced it, to the identity and development of being African American, and then what it meant to be Black in the United States, and how that shaped women's roles as a Black woman was very different from what a white woman experienced. Likewise, Native American women, and how they experienced life even pre-European arrival, to how that drastically changed and how they viewed that through early colonization to the Revolutionary War, and what did that mean from that perspective, versus the poor versus the wealthy, versus indentured servants versus whoever else. That is an important component of history in general, is not limiting yourself to one perspective. And that's ultimately what has happened with, going back to just women as a whole for a minute, is that traditionally women have kind of been pigeonholed into those three defined areas, and largely excluded from the narrative, like many other minorities, and not just in the United States. In most history courses, there is a smaller level of focus, unless it's a specialized course like this, on other groups. And in part that is because, you have the cliche, but the history is defined by the winners, is a component. You have those who are in power get to kind of determine the narrative. And so it is better in the sense that within the last 10 years, there's definitely been a massive push, and maybe 15 years at this point, of trying to expand the narrative, to not keep it in this kind of narrowly focused way, but instead look at how others experienced history. Not just those that were in power at the time when it's written, or when it happened, right? And so the difficulties of this, there's a video up called A Midwife's Tale, about Martha Ballard, and it was based on her diary that she wrote, which diary may not be what we think now. It was more like notations of here's the weather and like a quick snippet of what she did for the day. But the Midwife's Tale is a book, and the author is in this kind of documentary reenactment video. It's really good, but she briefly comes in and talks about it. And one of the things that she says is that it's difficult when you're looking. The further back you go, the harder it is to find documents and evidence written in by women. And you could expand that out to minorities in general as well, that you just have a small amount of records. Probably the best example of this would be ancient Greek society. Women, if you want to look at one of the most marginalized societies for women, ancient Greek society was that. And there are almost no documents written by women. There's just a few. So we have all of this literature, all of these primary sources and documents written by people in ancient Greece, 99% by men. So then you have the problem of how do you address it? And I'll write that one down too, is how to approach the study of women in U.S. history, or we'll just say the study of women in history. So what the issue becomes, right, then is that finding sources written by women. Because if you only have sources written by men, it can create some issues of perspective. And one of the things with this is that, there's various reasons why we don't have a lot of sources by women. Obviously, just having documents from a long time ago, only so much of it lasts. So it doesn't mean that women weren't ever writing or recording, but if they weren't significantly key figures, those documents likely were not preserved and maintained and being able to be used hundreds, if not thousands of years ago, depending on what history you're looking at. The other thing, of course, is that you had an issue with women and literacy. If you go back in history, massive amounts of the population, whichever the gender, were not literate. And literacy is something that continued to increase and expand throughout time, and we'll look at this within the United States as well. Consequently, men were more likely to be literate than women, and therefore you have less documents written with women's voices. One of the other things that then this creates then, of course, is that if you only have documents or mostly documents written by men, is that, of course, then the perspective of women it is based on from a male perspective. On male perspective. So, right, you have to then start kind of being a detective to determine whether is this an accurate portrayal of how women lived during this time, or is this the male perspective of how women lived at this time. And again, much of what we look at with women can apply to any kind of marginalized group in society, because most of the time their voices are not heard as loudly until more modern times, where the proliferation of writing, literacy, technology allowed for kind of mass production of people's voices, that can be video as well, and then up to the internet today, right? Historians are going to have a different problem in the future, which is going to be an overabundance of information. How do you sift through all the Twitter and Instagram and TikTok videos to find the sources you want to understand society or a particular group of people during that time, or how people lived or acted or what they did? They're going to have an abundance of wealth of information, right? Versus more older ancient history, you're the opposite issue, which is you have a limited supply of information. And this is then where historians look to artifacts to help support that, as well as other records and things that way. But primary sources can come not only in documents that were written during the time period that you're studying, but also looking at any type of artifact or object from that time period as well. And that can be incredibly helpful. That can be a photograph, that can be a statue, that can be tools that were used during that time period, that can be household goods, that can be magazines that sold items. All of these things then are helpful in supporting and providing a narrative that can expand upon what you have. Okay, so that's kind of the, how it was structured, and the issues, as well as kind of how we're going to expand and look upon it. So the first theme or overall aspect that we are going to look at and see, again, over and over and over again, has to do with work and sexual division of labor. And from the very beginning, women's roles within the labor force were always defined by their gender. And I think the other thing that's important to connect with this is that women have always labored and contributed. There's sometimes, I think, the misconception that, well, women didn't really start working until, a certain time frame when they went outside of the home. And that's not accurate, because you have Again with the three, I didn't realize when I was setting this up how much it was broken into threes. So the first one is unpaid labor at home. Right, so this is often, and we'll look at debates in different periods in the U.S. where there's a whole debate about what is labor at home. And there's debates about, and women having debates and arguments about how to make their labor recognized, make it visible. There becomes a whole thing that labor at home initially is visible because people had farms and they lived at home, and their home was also their workplace. We'll see with industrialization, there is a massive shift in separating the domestic home sphere and the work sphere or public sphere. And what happens then is that women's labor becomes much more invisible. There's always a layer of invisibility to labor at home, whether that's raising children, cleaning, cooking, etc. Yet there always was a layer of invisibility. But it was more visible when your husband worked at home too and could see what you were doing, versus with industrialization, men really for the first time in mass were leaving the household and going and working outside the home. And so then they would come home at the end of the day, and all of that labor of child rearing, of cooking, of cleaning, of whatever else was now just done. And so the labor shifts to this invisibility. So one of the things that women do is they create the cult of domesticity, which we will get into when we get to that point, intentionally to try to make their labor not just visible, but valuable. And saying that the work that women do at home is a noble profession, right? It's something that's valuable and something that should be recognized, not something that isn't really labor. So it's a fallacy to suggest that women didn't start working until they worked outside of the home. You always had unpaid labor at home from the beginning of human society. That was there. Now the next one is slavery, and we could, and you could include, we'll say, and indentured servitude. Right, indentured servants were different because they had a contract with a set time frame for how long they worked. While they were indentured servants, they often, in early colonial period, indentured servants really functioned as the slaves of the time until it shifted to actual full-fledged slavery and the use of Africans for slavery. But it wasn't slavery, because slavery means that it is your children, especially within the United States. Slavery doesn't always mean that around the world, but slavery is often, there's no contract, there's no time limit. And in the United States, it also became based on not only you, but generational. You, your children, your children's children. Now, again, that the generational part doesn't have to be part of the definition of slavery. It's more just there's no contract. You're getting nothing out of you're not agreeing to it, and you certainly isn't for an exchange. Indentured servitude, you willingly go into a contract, sometimes actually not willingly. There are people who put their children into indentured servitude. Someone willingly put the person into indentured servitude, and often what were the individuals, but it has a contract, a time limit. And so there was more potential for getting out of it. Nonetheless, both of these type of forced unpaid labor were also a component that was labor that women participated in, and was significant to the formation of society, the building and construction of society, and we're going to look at that in its various forms. And then lastly, the one that often is the only one that's considered, paid labor. And this, which, while you could get paid labor from home, early paid labor tended to be outside of the home. And again, a lot of times when you're talking about work, that's kind of became the definition, paid labor, and everything else is just like, yeah, that's just women things, I guess. that's not labor, and it very much is. And so we're going to be looking at how these different definitions of labor played a role in that. The other way we're going to be looking at it is the sexual division of labor, right, which is that second part of the title. That from the start of human history, as I mentioned, there's always been a sexual division of labor, male labor versus female labor. Now, what that definition is varies from culture to culture. Okay, so that's important to know, that there is not one standard sexual division of labor, and here's how it's defined by labor, defined by gender, and it applies to everyone. No, every culture is different in how they do it, but here's the thing, every culture does it. Around the world, throughout time, every culture has divided in some form labor through gender. Now, some cultures it's very minimal. You only have very small differences in that division, and of course in a lot it's significant. And then again, what that is. So to give you an example of kind of how that varies from culture to culture, a great example of that is Native Americans versus Europeans. Right, and this is something, all of these things we're going to get into more, but I think that it's one of the most apparent, because not only do the Europeans constantly talk about it, they notice it. The Europeans show up in the Americas and they immediately notice a difference in defining labor through gender roles. And then, of course, using their viewpoint as the one that is correct through the Eurocentric views of the world at that point, they immediately saw it as wrong as well. So to give you an idea of this, Native American women, and this also just gets broken down by tribe. So I am generalizing a little bit here because there were some tribes that did not follow this. But the majority of tribes at the time when just before Europeans were showing up, tended to follow this way. So just don't take it as this means all Native American tribes all did this. That overgeneralizations never work. A lot of them did. So we're going to talk about it in terms of the majority tended to follow this route. But of course, like I said, there were various tribes that were actually more aligned with European views of labor and gender. But the majority were different. And so how it worked is that you had women who, actually let's put it over here. For Native Americans, women were often involved with food production. And we also see this in the shift from hunting and gathering to agriculture. One of the things that significantly shifted women's roles and value in society was the transition from hunting and gathering to agricultural-based societies. Hunting and gathering societies were relatively egalitarian because there's what is, I'll leave a little room for what I want to add there with that. Actually, let's put it over here. You can determine the status of anyone in any, or any group. It doesn't boil down to an individual. But any group or idea based on the value in society. And this applies to any time period, any society. If you know what the value is in that society, those who participate in that value are most often going to have a higher status. There are always anomalies, but in general. So for example, in hunting and gathering, the value was production for survival. You had to produce in your tribes to survive. If you did not produce, you died. And production was a variety of things. Hunting, gathering, raising the children, making the clothing, setting up the tents and housing, etc., etc. If you didn't do those things, your group died. Women in hunting and gathering societies, like full-on hunting and gathering, there's no agriculture at this point, they did a ton of work. Men were the ones that usually hunted large game, like the mastodons, the mammoths, and that type of thing, and that took up a lot of their time. And this left women doing the majority of everything else. Consequently, women produced, and that was the value you needed to produce for survival. And so you had a much more egalitarian state of being during hunting and gathering societies, because women were equally, if not more, doing the value in that society. And so they had an equal, or even, like I said, there's arguments, valid arguments for that women in hunting and gathering societies might have had a higher status. But at least we can say with certainty that they were of equal status. And that's because of value. Today, it's money, right? Our value today is money. And as a culture, as a whole, as a people, those who have more money tend to have higher status in society. Again, always outliers, but in general, that's how it works, right? And so when agriculture comes into the world, it shifts the value still to production, but production of farming, because farming created land wealth, food wealth, and ownership of land. All of this then became central for the new value. It's production, but a different type. Well, men in most areas, in Mesopotamia, in Egypt, in Eurasia, and so whether they moved up into Europe or China, India, etc., etc. You could just, all the way through a good chunk of the world, men took over agriculture. And while women were still doing all of the same roles that they were doing when they were hunters and gatherers, that was no longer the main value. Yes, they were still producing, but the value was now a more specific production, and their status went down. Where we see a difference is that women in a lot of Native American cultures held on to food production. And because they held on to food production, it gave them a higher status in society, because that was of part of the value in a lot of Native American cultures. There's other components, and we'll get into that in more detail with the next lecture, but that played a role. But what happens with this, because they held on to food production, this meant that the division of labor by gender was different, right? Because for women, then it was that women's work was the farming and harvesting. But for, and then men's labor, or division of labor within a lot of Native American cultures, were to be warriors. And then they were the chiefs too. But so we could put politics. There was some movement between the two, and we'll examine that as well. But so that's for Native Americans. For Europeans, it was different, right? So the sexual division of labor and this we'll see when our next lecture. The division of sexual division of labor, or the labor by gender, is super important, because it defines a lot of rights, freedoms, opportunities, experiences in life, and in that society that you have. So it's not just like, oh, okay, that's nice to know. It significantly structures how you live your life, what you can do in that society, how much power and authority you have in that society. So it's an important thing, which is why we're going to look at it through all of the time period from the beginning of Native Americans pre-European arrival all the way till the end of the 1950s. We're going to keep coming back to this sexual division of labor. For Europeans, though, the sexual division of labor was much more what it had become in Mesopotamia and a lot of the other world with the shift to agriculture, is that women their role was the domestic sphere, right? They were at home. And for men, that role was to do, we'll put agriculture, food production. We'll keep it consistent. This later moves to outside labor as well, and other things. But if you're looking at like the early colonial period, right, when the Spanish, the French, and the English were showing up, the Europeans coming over, right, what they observed, and again, got obsessed about it and wrote quite a bit, to the Europeans, when they would observe the Native Americans, they said, the women are doing all the work. The men just sit around and do nothing. They're lazy, and they're forcing their women to do all the hard work. And they actively tried to make these various tribes shift their definition of labor by gender, and saying that women were supposed to stay at home and men were supposed to farm. And this creates a whole bunch of disasters within Native American communities, as well as completely marginalizing women's rights and power that they had in these tribes when it shifts to when the Europeans force that change on them. But that's that viewpoint, right? To the Europeans, what they observed, because their sexual division of labor was women stay at home and raise the children and cook and clean and do that. Men, are the ones that do the work outside with farming or running a business. There were merchants and blacksmiths. So that men had either specialization in labor, or the majority were still farmers, food production. And that was what you were supposed to do, because that's what had been embedded in their society. So when they saw the Native Americans doing this other, they saw it as from that perspective, that men were lazy, that they were forcing their women to do all of the hard work, and that it was wrong. And that to them, forcing that change was seen as like, we're helping, we're making it better for women. But that's also kind of coming off of a narrow definition of that. And then the other part of sexual division of labor, which I mentioned, the domestic sphere, is that all work outside of the home, right, obviously in the home, for women, gets defined, gets connected, we'll say, to the domestic sphere. So obviously this happens with women working in the home. But here's what's interesting about this, and I'm gonna constantly be like, see how this connects back. Any kind of, we'll say, evolution of women's labor outside of the house, that in order for it to be accepted in society, had to be connected to this. We'll say to this to be accepted in society. There. Okay, so what this means, right, is that anytime there was an attempt by women to add additional work that they could do, and have it be accepted, because it didn't mean that there wasn't some work that women pushed and did that was not seen as appropriate or generally accepted or readily available for women. But midwife, you're going to be watching A Midwife's Tale. That is one of the earliest jobs outside of the home that was accepted as a role for women. And why was because it could easily be connected to the domestic sphere. The domestic sphere is motherhood. It's raising children. It's taking care of sick children. It's cooking. It's cleaning. It's all of that stuff. Midwives help deliver babies. They also often were like nurses and doctors and took care of sick children and women. They didn't usually help men unless it was an emergency. It was midwives then took care of the sick children and women, and then where it originated very specifically was, of course, childbirth. But it naturally evolved into including a midwife was almost rarely just a midwife for childbirth back in early colonial society. She usually was also the nurse and doctor. And so this was seen as, okay, that's easy to connect. Women raise their children, they take care of their children when they're sick, they cook and clean. Delivering babies is a no-brainer of how that's connected to the domestic sphere and that. But taking care of the sick and women and children, well, one, they're taking care of women and children. Two, Part of taking care of women and children is cleaning bandages, cooking stuff for them, making different medicines, gathering plants and herbs to do so, which was also women's role all the way back to hunting and gathering. So it was connected. Now, one of the later jobs, but still relatively new, right after the Revolutionary War, is that women started to be accepted to be elementary school teachers. They didn't have the term elementary school, but it's the best definition for the age range that women broke into the teaching role outside of the home. And again, this is going to get connected back to the domestic sphere, and we'll see it over and over and over again. Every single job that women are able to advance and be made acceptable in society is connected to that domestic sphere. The other part of the division of labor is that by inherently, we could put under domestic sphere because it is important, but it goes with both the overall idea of sexual division of labor, but also the domestic sphere, is that when jobs become defined by gender, specifically once they get assigned, is that arrow doesn't go that way? Put it here. Once it gets assigned to women, it almost always automatically, there's only a few occasions where it doesn't, sorry, ran out of room there. So once it gets assigned to women, it almost always automatically devalues in money and value, we'll say status. So a good example of this would be nursing. Nursing was a male job until the Civil War, really. When women officially take it over, it becomes defined, and that's, I think, the key here, right, is that there's never like this, it's not till after the 50s. 60s you start to see some change. By the 80s it's less, although there's still cases of it, but it's not constant. But all the way, so let's just say up until the late 60s, it was almost guaranteed to be automatic that if a job, if women started moving into the workforce in a specific job that then became accepted in society, that was because they could connect it back to the domestic sphere. I mean, heck, even getting the right to vote, women are going to use tactics like connecting it back to the domestic sphere in order for people in society to accept it as something women can do. But once that happens, then it becomes a female job. The term that's often used in gender studies and sometimes in women in U.S. history in general is pink, or in economic studies, pink labor. This term, and of course the pink labor just being the idea of the color connected to women, which is funny, right? Pink used to be the color for boys, and it was later that it shifted and switched, and pink became the girl color and blue the boy color. Pink in a lot of history where we have records of when they cared about color and defining it by gender was initially a color you put your newborn baby boy in pink, because that was a color for boys. So pink as a definition or a color that has gender associated to it, was a more recent construct. But anyways, that the name is because, of course, that idea that people see pink as a color for women, for girls, when you have the gender reveal. If you have a girl, it usually is pink. That is what you see. Pink labor then is that term that was defined by again, academics essentially, later, was the idea that once women were able to get a job classified as acceptable for them, like nursing, it became a pink job in that it now was exclusively for women, because it automatically devalued in money, in the amount of money that you could make for it, as well as status. And so men stopped working in those jobs. And that show, I mean, you see that, and it took only until the last 20 years do you have men actively starting to become nurses again, because it was so ingrained in this idea that nursing was for women. And there are still people will tell you today, doctors that get called nurses when they're female doctors, and when there's male nurses, they often will be called doctors by patients, because there is so much still this association of that job as connected to gender. So all of those things we're going to be looking at. The next one then is let's see, it has two. The next one then that we're going to be looking at is politics and gender. And this goes with the labor and gender in many ways. Women, for most of history, most of U.S. history, so we'll just keep it a history, because really it's around the world. Most of history have been formally, and that word is important, right, excluded from politics. And whether that's in conversation, whether that's in actual positions, whether that's in voting rights, so voting, positions, discussions. Now, I say formally because while, yes, formally they have been excluded for most of history in these rights, in this participation, women at every step in United States history have been actively involved. So they may not have been formally involved where they were a senator or got to vote, right? But they were involved informally in pretty much everything. And I think this is where you see, when we're talking about big events, big names, or helpers and supporters, is that women's roles within how they shaped U.S. history is often overlooked, because they weren't officially a politician. They couldn't officially vote. And so, when you have a discussion of politics, you talk about the president or you talk about Congress, and women weren't part of that. And yet they were constantly being involved in a variety of ways. You could go all the way back with Native Americans and look at women there. And what you would have is that women, they were the ones that elected the chiefs in a lot of the tribes. They were the ones that were responsible for that. They often also decided when or if to go to war. And they often participated in political discussions. And this will tie back to what we talked about with labor and work. Because women had gotten in on the food production with a lot of tribes, they got more status and more power. And so they were more formally involved than others. But even besides that, you can go, like I said, the Revolutionary War. We're going to look at labor reform. Looking at protests. And boycotts, political discussions just in general within that, the abolition movement, right? And I could go on and on. all the things we're gonna look at, and then finally, more formally, with the 19th Amendment and the right to vote. Right, that comes into play eventually too. But even before they get the 19th Amendment and the right to vote, which then leads to more avenues of officially being involved in politics, women were involved in politics. And we're going to look at that and how and what they did. I think that's one of the fun things about teaching this class, is that a lot of people just don't realize how much women were in every facet of U.S. history and the creation of U.S. history, how much they did in the Revolutionary War, and how much they were involved in the politics, because politics kind of got shoved into this idea of that it was the public realm, right? You have the domestic realm, or sphere, and then you had the political sphere. The political sphere was inherently male, and male dominated. And so then it tends to often then dismiss women as, well, they don't participate in that. But they did, even if it wasn't formally that way. And then the last one is looking at family and personal life. And what was the definition, discussions. Obviously, the big thing, which we're going to come to a lot, is motherhood. Because the reality is that motherhood was an identity. It was a huge identity of women. And in fact, it often got the title of defining a woman as true womanhood, right? To reach the pinnacle of true womanhood, you had to have children. Not everyone agreed with this, so don't take that as that's what everyone believed, but it was a general sentiment in society, or at least what was being pushed. And so many women then were defined by motherhood. And what did that mean? What did it mean when women challenged that? What did it mean when women looked to be defined by more than just motherhood? What did it mean when that was pushed as what should be done? And then on top of that, the reality that personal and family life were often discussed in the development of the United States. And so what this meant was that who could marry whom, what forms of sexuality were okay, what were acceptable roles in personal and family life. We'll just make that assumption here. I won't write that again with that. So acceptable roles of a woman, who should care for children, right? All of these things became specifically intense topics of public and political debate. So even, personal life and family life were not private in that sense, right? There was lots of discourse of how one should act, what is acceptable, and that the idea that should be, we could add that here. We'll put it with this. There was some obligation to be regulated by society, government, and laws, so that what should be given in laws, what should be the government control in making these decisions. As much as it says personal and family life, it was never just personal to your family and your individual life and your family. It definitely was the idea that society had a say in all of that. And really this idea that we're going to look at, that society had a say in how women could behave, how they could act, how they could dress, that the list we just put here, everything, that society had a say in all aspects of defining women, what jobs they did, what if they could be in politics, what the role that they were supposed to play in society, to the point, like, again, that you will see laws are created to define that. And it's not the same everywhere. In the US, we'll see, for example, a really good example of that is that in the South, during the antebellum period, when you have slavery at its height, Southern white women and the definition of motherhood was very, very different than in the North, because slaves often raised the children. So if you praised motherhood there, you ended up inadvertently praising the slaves, and the South didn't want to do that. So they changed the definition of what motherhood was, as well as what the values for women were in the South for white women, versus, of course, then slave women, and what it meant to be a black woman in the South, and what it meant to be a black woman who was free versus slave. There were different definitions for them. And versus, again, most of the North had a very different definition with connected to motherhood and very central around that, because you didn't have slaves. Even when they had slaves in the North, their slaves were not often raising the children, where in the South, in the plantation homes, they were. So it varies, it changes through time, it evolves, it adapts, and we're going to be looking at all of that. So, okay, this one a little bit longer than I planned. It always does, and I apologize for that. As much as I try to keep it down, there's just so much information to talk about. But hopefully you're excited. This is a fun course. I love talking about this information. There's lots of fun things to share. And hopefully this gives you a little bit of a general roadmap for themes and ideas that we're going to be examining as we talk about colonization, Native Americans, colonization, early colonial society, Puritans, Revolutionary War. We're going to look at all the things you would kind of look at in U.S. history, but all from these perspectives, and focusing on what women did during these times and how they shaped society, how they viewed society. It's a lot. They did a lot. So I look forward to the course, and we will be looking at Native American women pre-European society, or pre-European America, in the next lecture.